true Zoom fashion. I think it's very very video conferencing chic. I think a lot of people do business on the top and comfort on the bottom. But cool. So Oliver, the one thing I wanted to do before we dive into our main conversation was run through a list of rapid fire questions. These are not questions you could prepare for. They are just a little bit of a fun way to get to know you a bit better. So try not to think about them too much. I will just knock them off the list, and you can answer as honestly
All
as
right,
you
cool.
want. But to start us off, after a really tiring day, how do you spend your evening?
How do I spend my evening? Good. Normally, depending on the weather in London, which is obviously very variable, um, I like to get out of the house because I've normally been working from home. So I like to get out of the house, go for a walk, or go for a bike ride, or sometimes just have a bit of a stroll around the neighborhood, really. And then definitely time for dinner. um, and then afterwards, I normally relax by reading. So I'm a fairly avid reader, and my evenings I'm normally reading a book. I will, like anyone, occasionally binge a Netflix series, or depending if I'm currently in that headspace. But most of the time, it's like read a book and chill out.
So then, on that, another question I wanted to ask was, what's a really good book that you've read recently?
Oh, great question. So on a sort of books that I read are either like pure entertainment, or I obviously read a lot of books that I think are going to help me in some way. And I've recently been reading a book called Atomic Habits, and I can't off the top of my head remember
Oh,
who wrote the book.
James Clear. He is my idol. I love that
Yeah.
guy.
So I found it fascinating. I'm trying to sort of implement some of the basic ideas in that book. I've long wanted to be in better shape and lose some weight and be more focused at work, and it's probably similar to most people's kind of personal goals list. And I've actually found like some of the stuff that he suggests is just really practical. And so now on my bathroom mirror, I have some of my like daily goals that I do in a little whiteboard marker. And then I create little boxes next to them at the beginning of the week. And then I literally tick off every day that I hit the goal that that particular box relates to. And I've just found it like fascinating how once you start to build habits, how actually you do become somebody who has that mindset. So it's almost like by behaving that way for a certain amount of time, you actually become that person. So, you set yourself goals of like doing more exercise, for example, and then once a couple of weeks go by where you are hitting that regular exercise routine, you start to feel like somebody who has that as part of your life. And then so when you don't exercise, you start to feel like I'm missing that. So I found that book absolutely fascinating. I'd highly recommend it.
Yeah, and I think like the cool thing with your mirror example is that's one of the things he says is to make it really accessible. And your bathroom mirror is something you look at all the time, so it's difficult to not see those habits and to not keep them top of mind.
I mean,
Top of mind, yeah,
especially working from home.
yeah.
Um, you know, the and I've set my and like some of them are really small things, like just in between phone calls, I'll do 10 push-ups and a couple of lunges, but then I have a daily tally that I'm trying to reach every day.
Yeah,
And it's just building really small little things into your routine, and that's part of the joy of working at home is you know you don't have colleagues laughing at you because you dropped to the floor between phone calls and and bust out some push-ups.
absolutely. There's that. It's a quote that I can never get out of my head, but it's from that book, which he says, "You don't rise to the level of your goals; you fall to the level of your systems." And I think that is just it's beautiful. And then another question: tea or coffee?
uh, Coffee, one in the morning, and then tea. I drink rooibos tea the rest of the day. Um, I've gotten to an age, I think, where if I have more than one coffee, I can't sleep at night. So coffee is definitely a first thing in the morning, and one and only cup in the morning.
So a bit of a kicker, and then you sort of just like
Yeah,
ride that
and I
wave.
just find like drinking less coffee, it has more impact. That like one coffee a day really seems to like click over.
And then what is something you're glad you said no to recently, and why?
To be honest, I can't really think of um, anything along those lines. Without without sounding too cheesy, I'm kind of trying to say yes to a lot of stuff. Like I've set up my I've set up my own business, as you know, um, and so from a business perspective, I'm definitely trying different things. And on a personal perspective, given that I now have complete control of my personal time, I actually have more time to say yes to stuff on on that front as well. So I can't think of any recent examples, but I'll let you know if something comes to mind.
And then, so as someone who lives in the UK now, but also a South African expat, I'll gladly take either answer for this. But what is one thing that cost you less than either 50 quid or 1,000 rand? That was the best investment most recently.
Um, I bought I can't remember the name of it now, but it's like a really cheap sort of knockoff Fitbit, and it cost me about 25 quid, and it tracks my heart rate and daily calories and step counts and everything else, and then you can plug it into your laptop and it like calculates, and it also works out like a more accurate sort of your calorie allowance and things
Mm.
like that. So yeah, and it works incredibly well for a fairly inexpensive piece of kit.
Amazing. So that was the little intro set. So thanks for participating. I thought that was really interesting, and we got a good book recommendation, which makes me very happy as well. But so just to start, before we dive into the main topic of our conversation, could you tell me a little bit about just about your company, and maybe you can sort of sum up your, I guess, your founding story in a few sentences.
Okay. So I started the company in November last year. Founding story is the I kind of got lucky. I was working for a company who changed direction. So um, working as a recruiter, you often obviously normally you have a non-compete, and when you leave one company, you have a restricted client list that you can't access. And I joined a startup business who'd begun their life as a recruitment company and then pivoted to become more of a consultancy. And at some point, we both realized we were going in different directions.
Mm.
And the director of the business, who's a very nice guy and also very sort of practical, we had a frank discussion, realized we were going in different directions, and he asked me what I was thinking about doing. And I said, well, actually, I've kind of almost always had in the back of my mind, do I go it alone one day? And he agreed to release me from my non-compete clause because we wouldn't be operating in exactly the same space, and because I'd actually helped them sign up some of the clients that they were now doing business with. Um, he released me from the non-compete clause, and I just thought I'm never going to get a better opportunity. I'm immediately available. I have a small buffer because he
Yeah.
paid for my notice period, gardening leave, etc. And I can immediately contact people who know me and have done business with me recently. And so I just decided if I don't try it now, I'm never going to try it. And yeah, I went for it.
Epic. And so SEEKR is a recruitment company, but just in terms of like your interface with the companies you work with, can you tell me a bit about what that looks like?
So so interesting. So SEEKR is a recruitment business, and the a lot of the clients that I'm working with are people who know me already. So I haven't yet. Well, actually, that's not strictly true either, because I have signed some businesses who've never worked with me before. But certainly to start off with, it was contacting people who already knew me. They had people working in their team who they hired through me, and it was a very easy conversation. Like, yeah, we've got roles on. Sometimes there was a bit more to get around in terms of, my contact. Let's say they're an engineering manager or a CTO. They need agreement from like HR, so we have to sign terms to enable us to do business together. But as with anything, if you've got a strong sponsor inside the business, it's actually quite easy to make things happen.
So who do you normally work with? That would be another question. Is like, do you normally work more closely with this, with like a CTO or an engineering manager, or does it range?
I mean, it varies. So, one of the clients that I work with at the moment is like a global media company,
Hmm.
and I'm working with a sort of subset of their business where they have a streaming application that does, like, for example, they stream UFC matches. So there's obviously a lot of really interesting technology that happens behind that. So whilst they're a global company, there I am still working. I know the CTO of that sort of smaller business within a business,
Right.
and I still have a very direct relationship with him and the hiring managers. And for me, and at the moment, most of my clients are direct contact with the people doing the hiring. I do have one company I'm currently recruiting for where um, everything is being funneled through their HR team or an internal recruiter because they want to anonymize all of the CVs because they think it's going to be better for diversity. Um, and and so that's how they've asked to do business. And so far, I mean, it certainly has its challenges, but in order to be successful, in my experience, you need to look after both aspects of that relationship, both the technical person who has the direct need and the HR person who's responsible for their hiring and onboarding process in order to like really build a good relationship with the client.
Diving into our conversation, I wanted to sort of set the context, just because I mean you and I spoke last time, but just to sort of set the scene. I mean your recruitment method saw a shift, and I think a lot of people can relate to this when companies had no option but to move their recruitment processes online, and that was also almost overnight. So it wasn't like a here's a 3 week notice period. It was like, cool, it's locked down. There's like rules and laws now that you can't go against. So you've mentioned that a lot of companies wanting to hire tech talent wouldn't even consider a developer that they couldn't meet in person before COVID-19. And I think you even said that a lot of your time was spent being like almost like a travel agent, making sure that devs could arrive at interviews and that companies who wanted to interview them were able to do so. But now location isn't that much of a deal or that much of a constraint anymore, rather. That means for companies that your talent pool increases, and you can actually look for talent from all over the world. And in terms of your role as a tech recruiter, um, it's almost like all CVs are essentially on the table now, depending on what companies want. But that impacts how you look for tech talent, and the processes around looking for tech talent or sourcing tech talent. So, just to start us off, could you, like, you work with software teams and you work with software devs, and like, what are the biggest challenges you yourself have felt in the tech recruitment industry with the move to a remote first approach or a remote friendly approach?
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, as you rightly point out, like location was a big consideration before, and with companies doing face to face interviews, even if the candidate's goals would take them to the location where the company was, until they were there, the company didn't take their application seriously, or would only take their application seriously if they knew that person had like a plane ticket booked and were, you know, already coming to London to attend interviews. That's obviously fallen away massively, and so like being able to interview completely remotely has totally leveled the playing field and has opened a much broader sort of talent market. It's much easier for devs and companies to interview. Also, as a developer, if you were in one location and you, let's say, broadly wanted to move to Europe, you kind of had to pick your battles because were you going to fly to Amsterdam, Berlin, and London? Probably not. You'd probably pick a city and focus on that city until you landed a job in that city. Whereas now you could easily target Berlin, London, and Amsterdam, and probably throw in San Francisco while you're there. So it does change the game dramatically, and it has also meant that um, even in the local market, you're seeing a huge shift. Like in the UK, if you live in the north of the country, or actually most places outside of London, salaries are significantly lower than the salaries on offer in London. And now with companies offering positions paying sort of London salaries, but offering them remotely, and even if that's partially remotely, like, come into London once or twice a month, that's so easy to do with the rail network in the UK. Um, people can easily attend regular meetings in a London office, but continue to live in Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, wherever. And one of the challenges I think we're going to find is there's going to have to be some sort of adjustment, because at the moment, recruiting for a client in London, people already living in London looking for a mid-level developer salary are now finding that people outside of London with much more experience than them are applying for the same position. And as a client, just, you don't have any particular loyalty or need to hire the person in London. So why pay that sort of, let's say, punchier midweight developer when you can get the experienced engineer for the same amount of money? And there is going to be some period of adjustment, and it's going to be really interesting to figure out what that looks like. It's almost like, you know, the expression "be careful what you wish for." Pre lockdown, if you spend time on LinkedIn or any online platform, or just talking to developers in person, remote working was like, top of everybody's list of like, oh, I wish companies were more open to remote, embrace remote. But everyone kind of thought like remote working would be my job now with my salary now, but I live on a beach. But it obviously it's not quite working out that way. And there are going to be some serious lasting impacts.
So what's interesting to the sort of scenario you just painted, and it almost feels like there's two like counter forces at play. The one being that for companies, as you just said, they don't have a loyalty to local talent. They can, in theory, hire someone from a completely different country, um, never meet them, and like, because they have more expertise or they have a very specific niche thing that they need, get that person. Um, at the same time, though, that person now can work at any company. So, like, when there's salaries that you might be able to get at a company like Google versus a salary at a team of 5 startup in like a remote location, there's like no way that they can compete with a Google salary. So there's like more talent, but there's also more
Yeah, look, I
competition.
mean, there definitely is more competition, and but this is where understanding what your clients are all about and understanding what your candidate really wants come into play massively. And this is where I think good recruiters will really differentiate themselves now, is where you're making when you're making a match, you need to make sure that match is more than the sort of superficial matches that in the past a recruiter would match up salary, some keywords, and location, and that was 75% of the job. Then they'd spend 25% of the time talking about motivations and long-term interests, and trying to dig deep into some of the other motivations of a candidate. But now, the location question has obviously fallen away, as we've discussed, but even the technical skill set, with companies writing individual services to do different things in the whole sort of microservice architecture, a company now might look at somebody who had PHP, JavaScript, like there's less of a, we are tied to doing our development in language X. And so you really need to understand more deeply, why would somebody want to work at this company? What sort of person would love this job? And what are the factors that the current development team like about the role? What keeps them there? What keeps them motivated? And then when you're talking to people sort of in the wild, you're trying to find people who have that shared mindset, and that takes more time, and really trying to understand the developer and what they're trying to achieve by moving jobs. And for some people, working at a big name, a Google, If that's top of mind for them, then you're never going to, you're never going to convince them to join your startup, and you're wasting, you're wasting your time there. Likewise, if salary is top of mind, then you just need to focus on, have I is my client a heavyweight when it comes to the salaries that they offer. But it's about finding those other motivators and the deeper underlying interests of the people that you're talking to, and then trying to create that connection between the developer and the company on a slightly deeper level. And that's where recruiters are going to spend their time and prove their value. Because if you then factor in things like, AI and screening tools that like search thousands of CVs online, pulling out keywords and things like that, well, even we all know that recruiters skim read CVs, let's be honest, but even the briefest of skim readings, you're going to fall behind like an AI driven solution on that side of things. So it's about getting into a really good conversation with the company that you're recruiting for, and with the people that you're trying to recruit for them.
So, I mean, I was going to ask what this remote shift, or the shift to remote work how it's impacted your process in terms of how you find matches, or how you figure out like which developers are going to work in which tech teams. And I think this is a very interesting part of your process that I think I'd just like to like maybe start with is like, how do you, what is your process rather for figuring out those motivators or having that conversation? Like, do you, what does going deeper look like? What is that?
Okay, so I mean, for me, one of the great additions to, also one of the great changes for me is, you know, before recruiters were phone-based animals, and you had to try and catch a developer on their lunch break or after work, and it didn't matter when you called them, that it was going to be a phone call. Um, Later in the process, you might arrange to meet for coffee, or you might, if you had a really good developer, maintain that relationship over coffees and beers. But most of your time was spent on the phone. One of the things that has changed massively for me is I now do all of my initial screenings as a video call, um, and it does just make that it's it's obviously not as good as face to face. Let's be honest, and that's something we're all learning about this new remote world. Is video isn't a replacement for face to face interaction, but it's certainly a step up on phone. So have and then the other good thing is, because people are working at home, you can find time that suits them to sit down for half an hour and really have a chat. So, they're not hiding out in the broom closet at their current company, hoping that nobody walks in. You can actually sit down and get into some of these things. And so I spend quite a lot of time focusing on what they enjoy about their current role, because actually that's one of the most telling things, is asking people, you know, that simple question: what is it that you most enjoy about what you're doing at the moment? And that will tell you a lot about what they actually value, as opposed to asking them like, what are you looking to do, which will give you slightly different answers sometimes. Um, and then spending a lot of time talking about the role that they're looking for. What do they think that looks like? What's important to them? And why? And then the follow-up question is why. Like, why are those things important to you? What does that mean for you? If you could find something that looked like that, how does that affect your career trajectory? Um, and this is just good recruitment, right? And there are lots of good recruiters out there. There are also loads of shit recruiters out there. Let's be honest, we all know it. And the difference, I made a joke with a candidate this morning. He and I had a video call, and then at the end of the call, I summarized, like, so essentially, this is what you're looking for. And he was like, yeah, that's exactly it. You've nailed it. And I was like, well, that's what happens when people listen when you're talking. And he laughed. And then I said, recruiters, the only thing you really need is a good pair of ears. Um, and and it is funny, because it is so incredibly simple, and yet people don't get it right all the time. In fact, they consistently fail to get it
Yeah, and I think there the crucial thing to remember is that simple does not mean easy. Simple just means like easy in theory, but it can still be really hard to do. And like you said, a lot of people still do struggle. But the listening thing is interesting, and just to tie it back to like actually figuring out a level deeper for like motivators, or to actually find like the real substance behind someone, what someone wants. I think instead of just asking, and this is just me paraphrasing what you said, instead of just asking like what are you looking for, or like what do you want from your next job, to actually ask a what do you currently enjoy, and also then to ask the follow-up of like, okay, why is that so important, like tell me about what that means to you. My assumption there though is that sometimes, and this is speaking from experience as well, because I find I struggle with this myself, is do people, like what happens when someone struggles to answer that? How do you how do you deal in those situations? Because I think a lot of people know what they want, but they don't really know why, or
Yeah,
it it takes some like massaging
it's
to get out.
interesting because you have to. Um, we obviously talked about the positives, right? Like, what do you enjoy about your current role? What do you want? The other really telling thing is to ask people about their frustrations. What would you change about your current role? Could you? Um, the I think part of the key is creating an environment where the person is comfortable discussing that with you. And as a recruiter, putting people at their ease and building rapport is a crucial skill. But it's also okay to just tell them that it's okay. So, I mean, I literally have that conversation sometimes with people in an interview. Like, look, I'm not looking for your polished answers to these things. Don't put yourself under pressure trying to deliver me like a really well thought out answer. This is an exploratory call. Like, the purpose of asking you some of these questions is actually to get you thinking, and you might come up with the answer straight away, but we might actually talk again next week, and you'll be like, look, I've really been thinking about it, and actually it's this that's most important. But it's encouraging people to be open. um, it's creating a comfortable environment in which they can do that. And then it's just telling them to, it's okay. So just give it, give me the full story, warts and all. In the interview that I have with the developer, they might tell me that, their colleague drives them up the wall and they actually cannot work with this person anymore. Uh, you know, and and obviously you won't build that into the pricing that you'd send over to the client, but what some of the underlying factors might be. Um, so it's just having that like really frank, open conversation and creating an environment where people are happy to volunteer the information. And sometimes that process can actually be um, enjoyable for the candidate as well, because whilst they probably think about some of this stuff, they don't often verbalize it. How often do you get to sit down with somebody who, as a willing and attentive audience, and really talk about like your job and what you love about your job, or what frustrates you about your job, and what you want next? Because even if it's your best buddy at work, you're talking about what drives you crazy at work, and he's waiting for his turn to speak about, like, yes, totally, that gets me too, etc. And that's a more natural human dynamic, right, where you're looking to exchange bits of information and compare and agree. But in an interview, it is a little bit more one-sided, where actually you have an attentive audience, and they're asking you to download some of this stuff, and you get a real chance to do so.
Yeah. And so that's on the candidate side, but from a client or a company side, how do you figure out the things that are actually going to hook someone? Because I think we briefly touched on this in our last conversation, but often like the company perks were tend to be very superficial, and not a lot of companies are very good at really telling their story, or really like selling candidates or selling developers on stuff that's gonna that's really going to align with their motivators. So how do you help companies figure that out? Or what kind of questions do you ask?
Probably very similar questions to the ones that ask candidate. First of all, try and create an environment where you agree that you're going to talk about things warts and all, because you know, any environment is going to have some factors that are less than ideal, and the company might be aware of those things and they might be working on those things. But you definitely want to know what those things are, because even if everything else matches, if some of the sort of negatives, or if some of the frustrations in the candidate's current environment match the client's environment, then that's going to very quickly cause an issue, and that's where you're going to get things falling apart during a probation pay, which everybody hates. Nobody wants to be in that situation. So having an honest conversation with the company. In an ideal world, you know the company well enough to have seen it from a couple of different perspectives. You know, like what Team A offers over what Team B offers. You know that they've actually, let's say, for example, I don't know, their DevOps type stuff is behind times and it's a mess. But then you also know that they've just hired an absolutely shit hot head of platform, and now you can offer that information. Like, look, on day one, it's not going to be perfect, but this is the person that they've brought in to deal with that. And so I think the number one thing you need as a recruiter in order to really successfully present a company to prospective candidates is access. Um, if a company are asking to, especially in this day and age, recruiting to a job spec really is not going to work, because as we've already established, you can write a script that will match keywords on a job spec to keywords on a CV, and now that you're seriously considering global talent, that's very quickly going to pull you back a list of people. um, and so you have to have that deeper understanding. And if one thing companies need to realize is, like, if we're going to use a recruiter, an external recruiter, and our internal recruitment team who have this access already are struggling to fill that position, then the external recruiter, regardless of how good they are, is not going to be more successful with less access. That is not going to work. And so again, it's a trust issue, and I understand why the reluctance exists, because unfortunately there are loads of shit recruiters out there. So you need to build the relationship where the company are trusting you to sort of come in, have a look around, and see the warts and all.
Yeah. So there's two things that I want to unpack there, because I think they're both really interesting. The one is on the, like, just doing a keyword search, bringing a bunch of CVs back, and the other is something that we spoke about just before this, around, like, if you put remote work as a perk, or if a candidate wants remote work from their next job. What you said to me actually was really interesting, because I don't think that's a very clear way of stating what you're offering, because that could mean fully remote, that could mean a day in the office, that could mean the autonomy to come in and out as you want. So in this new world, surely you have to, like, be really intentional about teasing that out with both a developer and a company before you put that forward, because down the line they could say, oh, I thought it was fully remote, and the company was like, no, we just meant, like, sometimes."
No, absolutely. I make the joke with candidates when discussing a role, like, you know, this is remote work, but it's not remote work where you get the job, and then in 2 months' time you decide you want to move to Bora Bora, um, and work from a beach. Like, it's remote work, but the expectation is you would be part of a team. They have an office in whatever the location of the office is, and they'd like to see you from time to time. And again, it's about matching up what expectations on both sides, because if you've got somebody who wants to be like a fully remote worker, um, actually don't think that many companies are interested in hiring people who wants to sit apart and operate as some kind of satellite, tiny satellite office. I don't think that, there are lots of developers who would happily take that arrangement, but it doesn't really work for a lot of companies, and it's about finding that balance. And so if a company is putting flexibility forward and going like, look, it's your, as the candidate, it's your life. You choose how you live your life. 90% of the time, but we would like to see you in the office from every now and then because actually,
Yeah.
we're a team. We want to have that level of
Yeah.
interaction. So definitely you want to tease out what remote means. There's also a lot of recruiters taking shortcuts right now, advertising jobs as remote, knowing full well that when things come to an end and hopefully normality resumes, that the company are actually not interested in having remote workers, and at best they're thinking about a day a week from home. And I think there's some train wrecks
Waiting to happen. Yeah.
in the future. Yeah, waiting to happen where developers have joined under one expectation and clients think they've hired somebody under another expectation. And I mean, look, that's definitely people need to ask questions in interviews and
For sure.
qualify a position for themselves and make sure it works. But if but if you've got people selling you an ideal that doesn't exist, it's quite easy to gloss things over, especially if you actually want the job and you would rather hear what you want to hear,
Yeah. So I
essentially.
mean, there's what I'm hearing is there's almost two things that you have to make sure are well defined when you're now looking for tech talent. The one is what your remote work um your sort of like day-to-day cadences are, but also your bigger team thing. So for example, it might be a 5 day a week remote job, but they'd like to see you every quarter for a team event, or they'd like to have you once a month for a planning session, which matters because that
Mm.
sort of details obviously impact where someone works from. And the other question is, how long are they thinking this is going to last? Is it like post-COVID, the same setup? Are they thinking of changing it after restrictions loosen? And knowing that from a company, and also what a candidate's, as you said, expectations are. I think that's sort of what I'm getting are two very important questions to answer.
Yeah, you definitely need to spend some time figuring that out for both parties, and also remote further opens up the possibility that you might employ somebody in a completely different country. And are you open to that idea? If a company said to me like, we can hire a remote engineer, then I might ask like, well, would you hire somebody in Europe? Britain's leaving the EU. That's going to have some impact, right? Like you're not necessarily going to easily be able to do that anymore. Or I'm South African. We're on a South African podcast here. We both know there are loads of great engineers in South Africa, and times time zone, you're only ever like an hour ahead. Sometimes you're 2 hours ahead, depending on you know. Um, but actually, time zone works perfectly, and English is the first language. We could easily hire people in South Africa, and with the exchange rate going the way it's going, hell, you could build a whole remote team.
Absolutely, yeah.
Although that said, in my experience, like actually South African developers are earning quite well, um, and even obviously you can't make direct contrasts, but if you're earning good money as a software engineer in South Africa, the lifestyle that you're living doesn't necessarily translate that well to earning good money as a software
Yeah.
engineer in Europe.
Just on that, like, what do you think are, like, for companies who aren't putting remote as an option, or their remote is, or their remote work lifestyle is very much like maybe a day a day remote or whatever. Do you think that that's going to impact their access to tech talent going forward, like companies who are not taking on remote work more with more vigor?
Yeah, I really think it will. I think if you tried to, and obviously we're some time away from anybody actually being able to do this, but if you tried to go back to a world where you had the majority of your staff in the office 3 days or more a week, that is going to seriously impact your ability to hire people. So I think that will be a major consideration. Luckily, look, I mean, companies have definitely realized their own self-interest in this equation. Let's not be silly. Like they're looking at the lease on their office and going, we're paying for a really nice office and we got lots of desks here. We don't need to pay for, hopefully, they still pay for a nice office, but it doesn't need to be as big. And they don't need all of that space. And even if they do get their people into the office, if you're getting people into the office on a rotating basis, you can reduce the size of your space by 50, 70%, and still offer an office for people to go to and collaborate. So I think most companies are rapidly are realizing the advantages are also in their
Yeah.
favor.
And then the other thing that I just wanted to touch on before we wrap up was this idea of all these CVs that you have access to now, or almost like all CVs are on the table with this location independence. And the sort of experience I can relate it to is I've been looking for flats recently, and I put in my like budget, and I stuck within the city center, and there was like a handful of places. And the minute I took location off, I had like 900 results, and I panicked because I was like, this is too much for me to look at. I can imagine the experience must be similar for when location is no longer such an impact. And you've said just now that just matching job spec to resume is not enough because motivators are going to be completely different. So how do you sift through, like, how do you do resume screening with that many?
Well, luckily for me, as an external recruiter, you don't I don't think you get overwhelmed in the same way that you would if you're working for like a really good tech company as an internal recruiter, and you put an advert out using the company's branding. Whilst I try very hard to create original and compelling job adverts, people know that it's through a recruiter. So I don't get the sort of raw volumes in terms of my ad response. I actually still quite proactively still go out and approach people. But when it does come to the CV stage, I am absolutely brutal with CVs. I will, fire back an email to a candidate that will reject on the basis of their CV, offering them some CV guidance, and I have a template that I use. Um, and 99% of the time, you never hear from them again, and that's okay with me, and that's okay with them. Um, every now and then, somebody comes back to me and goes, "Thank you very much. This is useful advice. Here's my revised CV." And then at that point, I put them on the call list. They've made an effort. We, they're engaging with the process, and I've got time for that always. Even if they are actually not quite right for the job, too junior, or I have some other concerns about their skill set, I'll make time for the call. And to be honest, that whittles down most of the field. And I find, I do find that my days can get full on because I'm booking like a 30-minute initial screening with a lot of people, and obviously a lot of those screenings dead end once we get into the deeper motivations. And that's the whole point about just being able to match skills to job, and really needing to dig a bit deeper, especially for remote roles. Um, so yeah, I mean, I do have days where I sometimes feel like I don't get up, and I spend the entire day smiling at somebody through a web portal.
If it if,
um,
if it wasn't clear already, you were under no obligation to smile. If you need to give your your general demeanor a break, I will totally accept that because I
no,
understand
look,
it's stressful.
I tend to find the humor in most things you need to as a recruiter if you're going to stay sane. So yeah,
Nice.
I'm I'm fairly a positive kind of person.
But I mean, so if am I correct in saying then that it's rare that you make a once-off call face value? Like if so, I mean, for example, like if obviously if a job spec and a resume don't really match, that then maybe doesn't get shortlisted as someone that's a potential fit. But do you in some cases uh even if the job spec and the resume don't match, do you still jump on calls? Because my gut says that if someone's motivators are aligned, like a year or two experience difference, or like a thing that maybe a company says would be a beneficial trait but the candidate doesn't have, like those things tend to matter less because if motivations are really well aligned, someone's going to pitch for the job and they're going to do their best.
Yeah, look, absolutely, and that's something about what are you prioritizing when you're looking at CVs, and the things I look for are perhaps slightly different than just trying to match the key skills. So I spend I spend a fair amount of time if I get a well written CV. Also, I think the motivations are different as an internal and external recruiter, right? Because if I get somebody who's too junior for one job, but they're clearly like a great junior, I'm definitely still going to want to talk to them. Whereas as an internal recruiter, that might not necessarily be the case because you are busier dealing with volume. Um, so I, I think definitely from my perspective, I'd go a bit broader on conversations. But then there's other things that I'm looking for in a CV. Like I am quite picky about things like longevity in roles, and I know it's a bit controversial. But for me, if the candidate has a string of roles that are less than a year and they're not a contractor, like I probably am not making time to jump into a video call with that candidate. And look, that might be harsh, but I have to make some decisions. And as a general rule, when companies are looking to pay a recruiter a fee, they're looking to see a great CV, and obviously then underlying that, they're also expecting to interview a great engineer. And the more times the great CV matches up to the great engineer, the more they like you as a recruiter because you're consistently making that link. And then look, once you've got the relationship with the client, then sometimes you are going to take a flyer and go, look, you might not like this CV on face value, but I'm recommending that you speak to this person. And if you've built capital with the client, then you can have those conversations. And that's where life gets great as a recruiter, because you become that trusted partner and go, trust me, have a look at this, have a chat with this person, and you won't be disappointed. Obviously, that capital can be very quickly spent, so you need to be careful.
And just on the role longevity thing before we run out of time, why is that a trait that you're picky on? Like what does that generally result in? Or why is that a flag for you?
Look, because life is frustrating, right? And if somebody's response to frustration is to consistently move jobs, like essentially they're given, there is I and again, like, look, everybody's got their own style, right? But for me, resilience is a key characteristic in success. um, and I just think that somebody who consistently moves jobs fails to demonstrate any resilience. Like, could it, everybody gets unlucky. You could join a company that it's an absolute shit show and you need to get out of there, let's be honest. But you know if if consistently you're joining the company and something's wrong with that company, at some point you've got to go like, well, you've worked for 5 companies in the last 5 years. Is it possible that maybe you're the problem? And you have to start thinking about those kinds of things. And so yes, it is one of the things that I look at on a CV. And I know you start that conversation online and see where that takes you. Like, people feel quite passionately about this, but for me, I'm in the business of providing candidates to my clients that I believe are going to be a good hire for them and are going to be there for a long time. You know, if you're consistently sending clients people who move on within a year, that's painful and expensive for the client. Look, I mean, it's a short-term strategy as a recruiter that could work quite well, but it's a disaster really long-term with you and the client. And so you want to find people that have that stickability, have resilience, and are going to be around. Especially if you're working in a complex code base, sometimes you've easily got a 6 month to a year lead time before an engineer is truly productive in the role.
Yeah. And just on the stuff you look for, because I had this conversation with another tech sourcer before, and she was saying that something she looks for is if someone wants a remote role, or if a candidate says they want a remote role, or a company wants a remote developer, to actually look for experience in a remote role before COVID-19, to not just let someone, or not look for someone who's had remote experience only since March. Is that something that you care about as well, especially going forward with like the remote friendly
No, look,
workplace?
I don't think it's relevant, especially for an engineer. Like, you're talking about highly intelligent people, and if you've done the rest of your job right, you are putting forward people for your clients who are quite self-motivated and have a good level of discipline, and as we've previously stated, resilience. So it's not going to be that's not going to your problem is more likely going to be on the client side. They don't know how to run a team of remote engineers, and that might create some problems. So I think that really depends on the level. Like if you're looking at mid to senior engineers and they've hadn't previously worked remotely, I don't think that's a factor for me. If you wanted to hire a team lead and you knew the team was going to work remotely going forward, then yes, I think it would be a big bonus finding the client somebody who had previous experience of running remote teams.
Interesting. So, I mean, that segues quite nicely into sort of a wrap up question I wanted to ask. But when you're working with clients and companies that are looking to hire bigger remote teams, um, you know, I guess it depends on the experience they've had, but what kind of advice do you give them, or what kind of things do you uh, remind them to consider when it comes to hiring a remote developer? And maybe you can talk to me a bit about like what kind of stuff do you tell them about, like if they haven't hired a remote team before? Like, is that something you bring up? Do you warn them about that? Do you give them advice for that?
It's not something, to be honest, it's not something that I've thought about too much, in terms of like in terms of like giving a client advice for long-term success with a remote team. Um, I think if a company have hired good leaders, that's something that they're thinking about, and given that they're actually software engineers, know how the job translates remotely and where it doesn't translate remotely. So that's not something I necessarily would get too involved in. I might, once we've all been doing this a little bit longer, I might start to build up my own opinions about these sorts of things. And um, and when I offer an opinion to a client, it's normally based on experience or having seen it go right or go wrong. And if I'm in a position where I thought a client was doing something that is going to adversely affect them, then I would say something. But right now, I would say that I'm probably not qualified to truly have an opinion on how to run a remote development team, and I'll stick to recruitment.
Yeah. But I think your earlier point touches on that quite nicely. That I think, companies who are maybe still a little hesitant about remote work should loosen up, or at least become a bit more open because of the opportunity and the potential that lies in it if you get it right. And that's not to say that it comes naturally. You probably still have to put a lot of work into running a remote team. Or not probably, you do. But yeah, I think the potential in there is
And
I
also,
definitely see it.
in a very real way, if you don't do it, you're going to lose the engineers you already have. They're the people that I'm talking to at the moment who know that their current company are still kind of anti, or would expect them to go back to 3 days a week in the office or whatever, and who've had that taste of freedom, should we say, like they aren't that interested in going back to the way things were. So as a company, you really need to think about where you're going to be prepared to compromise. And I suggest you start communicating that to to the people you have working for you, or you will lose out to companies who've already thought about this, embraced it, and are running with it.
Very interesting. And then, I mean, just as a closing, more general question, what's a piece of industry advice, maybe potentially within remote recruitment, but even just within recruitment, a piece of industry advice that you think people should ignore?
I'd say recruitment in general, you could comfortably ignore most of the advice that you get. It's all it's all people are often looking for like absolutes in life, right? Do this and this will happen. And there, as we all know, there are very few absolutes in life. And one of the things that you need to learn is flexibility. You're not going to set up a recruitment process that's going to work for you forever. You're not going to have recruitment partners who always work well for you. One set of behaviors is not always going to drive the same results. The main thing to to think about is like, you know, are we being flexible, and when is the last time we reviewed this? And that for me is kind of key. If you're looking to recruit successfully, especially if you're a company that doesn't regularly recruit, review your process. Maybe talk to a couple of different people and sort of see it from a couple of different angles, but think to yourselves, are we being flexible? Are we making it as easy as possible for people who are interested in us to find us, to talk to us, and ultimately to join us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's spot on, spot on, and also just in the spirit of not taking advice as absolutes, also to take that with a pinch of salt, just to to make sure we're not shooting ourselves in the foot. But thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insight. It was really interesting for me. I think some of the main things I learned were that in this remote world, like job specs and resumes are not, it's not a one-to-one relationship necessarily anymore. And I think a lot of my assumption that translates into like the way you would scrub LinkedIn or the way you would scrub other talent pools is going to change, and that it's not as easy as going like matching one-to-one. You actually need to dig deeper, which I think is going to definitely put a lot more pressure on whoever does the hiring, whether it's a CTO or an internal recruiter, to spend time with potential candidates and actually find out what are their motivators, where do yours align, and to take that step up. And I think a lot of companies, and acknowledging that competition is going to increase, because now a developer can earn a Google salary if they want. But I in my heart of hearts believe that if your motivators align very accurately, someone will gladly take a salary that they can work into a bigger salary, but they would rather take that first. But that's just my own opinion. We'll see how that plays out in the real world. But I think that's a big lesson. And then defining remote work as well, I hadn't really thought about until we spoke, but I think that's going to become very important to do, to actually figure out, what do we mean by remote work as a company, or what do I mean when I tell a company that I want remote work? What am I actually looking for or hoping for? And then, yeah, to also think about going forward, is this a policy that we're going to have forever? Is this a policy we're going to revisit when COVID? I'm crossing fingers I can say COVID ends. I think it's going to be around for a lot longer, but at least when restrictions ease. But yeah,
when we learn to live with it.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way of phrasing it. But yeah, so like I said, thanks so much. I really appreciate your insights and your experience, and it was a real pleasure having you on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's not often that I get people prepared to listen to all of my ideas in 45 minutes straight.
All it takes is someone who listens, right?
Exactly. That's all any of us are looking for, someone to listen.